Hey guys, what's up? It's Charlie here, and today we're going to be looking at 10 teens sentenced to life in prison. So we all know that only the worst criminals get life in prison, and usually they're at least over 20, but here are some mere teenagers sentenced to life behind bars. And I'm not talking about 25 years to life, I'm talking about hundreds of years in some cases. Before we get into it, why not subscribe and press the notification bell too. Coming in at number 10 is Brian Draper and TOREY ADAMCIK. So we're starting things off with two teens who were sentenced to life behind bars. When these two kids from Idaho were only 16, they decided to do something pretty terrible. They'd got into an argument with one of their classmates, Cassie Studdard. The feud between TOREY, Brian, and Cassie started in 2005, but a year later in 2006, Brian and TOREY still despised Cassie and vice versa. So they decided to get some revenge on Cassie. They got a knife and used it on her 26 times. Of course, that's absolutely awful, and Cassie did not make it out okay. The duo were instantly a massive media item in Idaho, not only because what they did was so awful, but they were so young while doing it. The craziest thing was the evidence found against them in court. After investigating, the police found a videotape belonging to TOREY. On it, it actually showed Brian and TOREY plotting what they were going to do. So this wasn't a spur of the moment thing. These people planned out what they were going to do and then did it in a terrible, terrible way. Next up is CHANCEY Luna. So this guy may have a pretty cool name, but what he did was not cool whatsoever. This teen was living in Oklahoma attending East Central University. One of his classmates was 16-year-old Australian student Chris Lane. Chris was a baseball player and played for the university's team. But CHANCEY and Chris did not get on. In fact, that's an understatement. They despised each other. One evening, the two got into a confrontation in a parking lot outside the university. All of a sudden, CHANCEY pulled out a handgun. He then proceeded to use it on Chris, shooting him in the back. Unfortunately, despite only being 16 years old, Chris passed away from the injuries. CHANCEY was instantly arrested. In court, he said he simply meant to scare Chris and not actually use it on him. But clearly that did not go to plan, and CHANCEY paid the price. Even though he was just 16 at the time, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This means he will live out his entire life from behind bars. Seeing as he was only 16, do you think a life sentence is too long in this case? Or do you think that because he took someone's life, his life should also be taken in a different way? Next up is Robert Cameron. So this one is coming out of Texas. Most 17-year-olds are just about to graduate high school. They're doing their schoolwork, playing sports, and having fun. But when it came to Robert, he was not doing that whatsoever. When he was 17, he'd already committed one of the worst crimes known to man. At 17, he took the life of a woman called Rachel Elton. Rachel was a youth counselor who was known as a very nice lady. But that clearly did not matter to Robert, as he took her life. In court, he showed absolutely no remorse and didn't even really seem to care. The judge was appalled and wanted to take his life, but because he was technically still a juvenile, he couldn't be given the injection. So instead, Robert was sentenced to life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Next up is Jose Reyes and Victor Alas. So when two 16-year-old boys get together, you may assume they're out to have some fun. But that is not the case for Jose and Victor. That is because these two are both obsessed with Satan. That's right, many people have a spiritual figure in their lives, and for these two, it happened to be Satan. Now, you may think that doesn't affect anyone if it's just in their heads. But the mind can be very dangerous, and these two teens believed Satan wanted a sacrifice. The two teens took 15-year-old Corey Ann Cervantes. They then, in the name of Satan, removed her eyes. They also used a screwdriver on Corey Ann Cervantes as well. And as if it couldn't get any worse, they hit her head, taking her life. Well, it was all to please and to give Corey's soul to Satan. Clearly, these two did not get much sympathy in court. And despite their defense attorneys arguing they were insane, which is probably the case, these two got life behind bars. Do you think because these two are likely insane they should have got life behind bars? Or do you think that what they did was so bad they fully deserve it? Next up is PHILLIPS CHISM. So we've seen a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds on this list. But now is time for a very young teen sentenced to life in jail. Like many 14-year-olds, Philip from Texas didn't get on with his teacher, specifically his math teacher, Colleen Ritzer. He had a strong disliking for his math teacher. But while most of the time that simply leads to students slacking off, for Philip, things were different. One day, the 14-year-old got a box cutter and took his math teacher's life. He then tried to hide her body in a recycling bin. He was caught on surveillance footage doing just that. And seeing as he was only 14, he wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. It took police a matter of days to track him down and arrest him. He had a very long and very complex legal battle. This is because people were so stunned that a 14-year-old would do such a terrible thing. His defense attorneys argued that he was hearing voices in his head, and apparently he was having some kind of psychotic episode at the time it was happening. Phillip even says he doesn't even remember parts of what he did because he was so out of it. But the judge simply wasn't sure if it was true, so he gave him a life sentence. Do you think that's harsh? You never know, Phillip could have been telling the truth. What's your opinion on a 14-year-old getting the life sentence? Next up is Antonio BARBEAU and Nathan PAAPE. So here's another double case of teens behind bars for life. When Antonio and Nathan were only 14, they did something terrible. They took the life of a 78-year-old grandmother. The most shocking part, it was actually Antonio's own grandmother. Can you imagine harming a family member in such a terrible way at such a young age? After they used an axe to take her life, they tried to steal some jewelry and some money. They wanted to make it look like a robbery, but because this left fingerprints everywhere, it took police only moments to track them down and arrest them. They were both tried in court at the same time, and it was a very long legal case, seeing as they were only 14 years old. Their court case was recorded and broadcast on TV, and in court, Antonio began crying. Nathan, on the other hand, looked cold and emotionless. The two were led away in their prison wear after being given a life sentence. However, Antonio can ask for parole when he turns 50, but that means he's guaranteed to spend at least 36 years behind bars. Next up is Lionel Tate. When you pay a babysitter to look after your child, you're putting a lot of trust in them. So that's why it helps to get someone reliable like a neighbor. Well, that proved out to be absolutely terrible in the case of Tiffany Unick's mom. In 1999, Tiffany Unick's mom had to go out. She left her Florida apartment and asked Lionel Tate, her neighbor, to look after Tiffany. Lionel was a 13-year-old boy who was very independent, so she thought she could trust him. But when she returned home, she found Tiffany was not alive and Lionel was nowhere to be seen. It turned out Lionel had somehow hit Tiffany and took her life. A criminal case began instantly, and in 2001, Lionel was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And this made him the youngest ever life in prison inmate without parole. He claimed that him and Tiffany were simply playing around. She then fell over, hit her head, and passed away. But for various reasons, the judge didn't buy it, and Lionel was sent away for good. Next up is Quantel Lotz. So we've already proved that some people take the lives of those close to them, for example Antonio BARBEAU's grandmother. But can you imagine taking the life of your own stepbrother? Well, when Quantel Lotz was only 17, that's exactly what he did. He ended the life of his stepbrother Michael Barden, who was also 17. Weeks before, Quantel had got a tattoo saying "dead man." He said that at the time, that is how he felt. And he said because he already felt he'd passed away, he thought it was okay to take the life of his stepbrother Michael. He was sentenced to life behind bars in a Missouri prison. But amazingly, Michael Barden's mother has forgiven Quantel. Can you imagine forgiving the person who took the life of your own son? Either way, she did, and is now working with the lawyers to try and get him released. But just because she's forgiven him, do you think that that means he shouldn't be in prison for what he did? After all, I doubt Michael would forgive him if he had the chance. Next up is Joshua Phillips. When this boy from Florida was only 14, he did the worst crime imaginable. He took the life of his 8-year-old neighbor Maddie Clifton using a knife. He hid her body under his waterbed for 5 days, and during that time there was a big search for Maddie. The entire neighborhood participated, and to try and blend in, so did Joshua. But after 5 days, Joshua's mum smelt something under his waterbed. When she looked under, she was stunned to see Maddie Clifton under the bed. His mum didn't think twice about turning him in and instantly called the cops. Joshua is now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Next up, we have Eric Smith. Being picked on is something many kids have to face, and Eric Smith was no different to those kids, except he reacted in a more outrageous way. When he was 13, Eric was walking around when he saw 8-year-old Derek Robbie. He then lured Derek into the woods in their town in New York. After doing so, he grabbed a massive rock and used it to take Derek's life. Eventually, Eric felt bad and confessed to the police. Despite his confession, he was sentenced to life behind bars without parole, and he's since done many interviews as an adult where he says he feels terrible about what he did. But sadly, you can't edit the past, and you can't bring Derek back. Do you think Eric should ever be released from prison or not? Check out the poll in the top right corner to vote for the craziest prison sentence on this list. If you guys want more amazing videos and something on a lighter note, then check out my second channel. There'll be a link to that on screen in a moment. But as always, thanks for watching. Check out some more videos on screen right now. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Top 10s.